Retirement is all different now. So I'm Ray Pointer. I'm the MC for today, and we're going to run through the process in just a moment. Before we do that, we're going to have a big shout out for all the NewMR sponsors. So we love bringing all these events. They do cost money. And for nearly all of you, they are free. One or two people elect to pay $2, but everybody else, it's free. How can we do that? We do that because these wonderful companies here sponsor NewMR. They cover the costs of the licenses, the cost of doing the transcriptions and the data editing and the video editing and all of that. So the next time you are looking for services, please do consider all these wonderful companies here. And if you are speaking to any of them, please do say how much you think it's great they sponsor NewMR, because that will encourage them to sponsor us next year too. So that's always a good idea. So I've mentioned the sponsors. We're going to have in a moment 3 presentations, and we will tell you a little bit about those in a moment. And then we're going into a Q&A and panel discussion. I'm going to introduce the panel. We've got the driving force behind this session here today, Dave McCaughan, Sue Bell, and Akikubo. So welcome to all of you. And I'm going to hand over to you, Dave, to maybe tell us why you set the session up today, and then to launch into your presentation.
Sure. Thanks very much, Ray. Welcome to everybody. Dave McCaughan. I'm coming to you from Sydney today. I do normally live in Bangkok, but COVID times, I've been in Sydney for quite a while. The session came about because I have a long history of trying to understand aging populations and working with companies around that. But then what happened was 2 things, I think. Last year, my good friend Akikubo in Japan co-wrote a book about preparing for the age of the 100-year life and the implications on retirement, etc., which we've talked a lot about, and Aki will explain more about in a few minutes. And then over the last 12 months, since I've been in Sydney, I've spent some time with Sue and found out that Sue was doing research in the space of understanding retirees in the Australian market. So I thought it might be good to bring it all together and bring together some different pieces of information and some new research and some ideas about not just retirement as such, but really about the aging populations and how, as we have more aging populations, maybe that affects attitudes to retirement, or, as I will explain, retirement, as I like to think of it. So maybe, Ray, we could get started, and if we just flip through a few charts. So the session we called retirement is all different now, simply because aging populations are different, and simply because there are many of us, funnily enough, all of us on this panel in that sort of 60s, early 60s stage, who are both trying to think about what we're going to do for the next 30 years, but also are reflective of the fact that the rest of the world has to start thinking about how it's going to deal with more and more people that are living through their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. This lady is really interesting. If you go to the next chart, this lady is known in Japan as DJ Sumiroff. On the left is her day job. She's an 83, 84-year-old lady who still runs her own noodle bar in central Tokyo, but she's also become legitimately one of the most famous nightclub DJs in the country. Not DJing for old people's homes, but DJing for literally clubs, DJ Sumiroff. And that's pretty indicative of, I guess, the change that's gone on that we might expect with an aging population, that we're seeing people move into new things in their second half of their lives, if you like. Next chart, please. If you Google, as I did the other day, and you Google something like aging Asia, you're going to see that all the charts have this thing, this arrow that's sort of indicating, well, aging Asia is just going to grow. And if you think about it, that's the reality. The Asia Pacific is a hotbed of aging populations. Next chart, please. If you look at all sorts of research, this is just a sample, Vietnam and China, for example. Yes, China, we sort of know, I think a lot of people viewing this will know that China has a fast aging population now. that it's going to have some chronic problems in terms of an aging, declining population by the year, probably 2100 in the end of this century. But even countries like Vietnam, for example, that we think of as young populations, the older population is actually the fastest growing segment of the population. It's only 8 or 9%, but it's growing faster than the rest of the population. Next chart. And that's true in every Asian market. I mean, one of those things about India, I travel there in normal times a lot, and I'm constantly told, oh, but India is all about, you know, a young population. And it's true, the vast majority of India is young, but interestingly, actually it's now close to 10% of the population is over 65. 10% of the Indian population is, of course, over 130 million people, and the fastest growing segment of the population is 60-somethings. Yes, there's a lot of young people, but proportionally, it's the 60-somethings that are growing fastest. So all markets are affected by this. Next chart, please. What's interesting, though, is that when we look at the idea of retirement or the age of retirement that we might think about it, somewhere between 60 and 65, 70, depending on the country you're in and the traditions of when we think about retirement. But the truth is that actually there's a lot of evidence to say that people today are a lot fitter at 65, or they have stronger bodies at 65 than biologically 65-year-olds should have, led by places like Japan and some European countries, but also Singapore, South Korea, etc. A lot of research is going into this that's indicating that people today, when they hit 60, 65, the reason why the population is booming is partly because infant mortality is crashing in many countries. So people are living through their youth and therefore getting to be old. But there's also a lot of indication that once they hit 60, the likelihood is you have about 30 to 35 years to go in most countries. And most of us don't think about that. When you have your 60th birthday, a typical, for example, today, if you were a woman in Tokyo and you turn 60 today, it's estimated on average, you will live to be 98 years of age. So at 60, you have 38 years to go. What are you going to do with that time? And it's not just sit around waiting to die. Next chart. In fact, there's a lot of publications. This is a very good book if anybody wants to read it, about the whole concept that we're now dying much later than we used to. We're living into a ripe old age. And the reality of that is, if you think about it, if you went back 20, 30 years ago, if you went back to when Ray was young in about 1942, then you would have found that when somebody died at 70, you said, oh, they lived a full life. Now, if somebody dies in their 70s, you say, wow, I thought they would have been older, or I thought they would have lived much younger. So, famously today, Charlie Watts from the Rolling Stones unfortunately died yesterday. He died at 80. And I actually heard on the radio somebody this morning saying, oh, 80, well, he didn't live that old. He didn't get to be that old then, did he? Because we don't consider 70 and 80 to be that old anymore. Next chart, please. All of that means that we're going through a lot of reconsideration. Now, interestingly, 10 years ago, if we were having this discussion, we would have heard a lot of talk about, 60 is the new 40. Remember that? 60 is the new 40. What we've seen in the last 3 years is the rise of since 2014, but really in the last 3-5 years, has been the concept of 60 is the new 60. It's no longer about trying to pretend you're 20 years younger or live the life of somebody 20 years younger. It's now about the fact that at 60, 65, 70, I'm fine. I can live my own life, I can do what I want, and I can reach out and expand my own horizons. Next chart, please. And all of that means that we're gearing up for a lot of change. And we're seeing constantly in all sorts of publications, lots and lots of stories about organizations, companies, and individuals who are gearing up at 60, 65. They're not winding down, they're now gearing up for the next stage. Next chart, please. So what that means is that we have to be a bit open-minded about the way in which we think of older people. Now, this was from a survey done just on 2 years ago in Thailand amongst Thai women. It asked women of all ages to identify what were the characteristics of different age groups. Now, when you look at those three columns, if you look at them quite quickly, one column represents baby boomers, one represents Gen X, and one represents Gen Y. So which do you think is which? Well, if you hit the button, Ray, what you're going to see is that the baby boomers are the generation that are see themselves and others see as optimistic, idealistic, interpersonal gratification, loyal and driven workers, and they can cope with technological change. What? They can cope with technological change. Well, the reason why that comes about is because according to a study done by MIT a few years ago, no generation has had to deal with technological change of as much and as common and as frequently as people now in their 60s. And in fact, that MIT study said that anybody under 30 has never had to deal with real technology change because all major technologies are now 25 years old. And we're just incrementally doing them, as opposed to somebody who's 60 who lived through the introduction of major technological changes. We've got to rethink a lot of these things. Next chart, please. All of this reminds me of the mythologies that, you know, people over 60 don't spend on new stuff. They don't try new brands. They switch from having good times to just surviving. They can't use tech. All of these are myths that constantly we're finding more and more research is proving to be myths about 60, 70-year-olds. Next chart, please. So we'll just skip to the next chart. There was a new study done by the Carter JMRN, sorry, Dom Carter's company in Tokyo recently. So this is Japanese. One of the interesting things there is that they asked people over 60 a whole bunch of questions and found that people over 60, 58% are working, 59% want to work, 47% have income earning jobs, 85% are trying to learn new skills, 63% are interested in learning new skills. So basically, they're doing stuff and they want to do more stuff. Next chart, please. When I first started looking at aging studies 4 decades ago, or 3.5 decades ago, literally in sociological studies, retirement was referred to as waiting for death. That's no longer true. Next chart. What we can see is that actually it's all about retirement. That people are trying to get more exercise and try new exercises. Ray can talk about that more than the rest of us on this panel. Trying to make a difference, trying to fill their passports, trying to new technologies, trying to find new jobs. It's an age at 60 of trying to do new stuff, not letting go. Next chart, please. So I wanted to finish just quickly with just a few points from a study that I've just done where I've been using an AI research technology partner of mine, Significant Systems, where we were looking at the narrative on the internet around particular issues. So we looked at issues around retirement across a few markets in the Asia Pacific region and a couple of highlights. You can see here that when we ask about the question of the machine, and we're looking at all the content, for example, that is talking about retirement in Australia, well, or retirement in Singapore, or salary men and retirement in Japan, for example, or retiring in Thailand. And we can get some feeling for what is really the story behind those narratives. If you go to the next chart, Ray, what I want to highlight here is when we look at the narrative around aging Asia, what we can clearly see is what we call a transient type narrative, which means it's basically something people know about. There's nothing new about it. It's something that we're sort of used to. There's a lot of continuous content, but it's basically repeating the same things, which is we still see reports. In fact, I saw a brand new report from a major investment brokerage this week that was talking about the fact that, guess what? You know, Asia is getting old. Yeah, we've known that for 30 years. What we need to do is be rethinking about what that really means. Next chart, please. When we looked at the subject of retirement or the narrative of retirement in, say, Singapore and Australia, we find that the way the platform works, it takes all those literally millions of pieces of content, reads them, analyzes them, tells us and plots it in terms of where it sees it in terms of the place of the narrative in in terms of whether or not it's making a difference. Is it timeless, for example? Yes, it's a continuous narrative that's never going to go away. It's really important. But look at the colors. The color wheels represent the emotions generated by this narrative. And you can see that in both Singapore and Australia, the red pinkish emotions, those are the negative ones, are not as strong as the green emotions, which are the positive emotions. And the purple and blue ones are about things like expectation and surprise. And you can see there's a lot of expectation, particularly in Singapore, a lot of expectation about the future, a lot of expectation about the security of the future. In Australia, a little bit more anxiety, but that's got to do with the fact that people are a bit more worried about things like, can they afford retirement? I'm sure Sue will talk about that in a bit more in a few minutes. Next chart, please. In Thailand, one of the things we looked at was the concept of retiring. And we found that actually the concept of retiring is still, the narrative still reflects a certain embarrassment and almost shame. The reason for that is because people don't like to admit they may not be financially ready for it, that they may not be able to cope with it. It's not because people don't necessarily want to retire, but it's because society there is still questioning whether retirement is an actual thing, and because most people don't have any preparation for retirement. And next chart. So what I want to do now is hand off to my good friend Akikubo, who has written this wonderful book. Unfortunately, the book's just in Japanese, so you have to keep on hiring Aki to give talks about what it actually means in English. So Aki, maybe you could explain your book.
First of all, thank you for having me today. I'm excited. So this book, How to Earn Money in the Era of 100 Years Old Lifespan, is a book that I co-authored just with my friends, Katsuyo. Katsuno, she's one of the country's best-known economic commentators, if you will, and Hiromi Wada, a business consultant, back in 2019, 2 years ago. The book is designed to give tips and advice on how to financially ready when the life expectancy is stronger than planned to retirees or 1 or 2 generations before. My background is actually marketing, branding, and communications. So, as you may know, Japan is one of the longest in the world when it comes to life expectancy. Japanese men are expected to live over 80 years old, which means that you will have more than 15 years of post-retirement time if you retire at 65 years old. In case of Japanese women, you will have to financially ready for 20 years plus. Since this life expectancy's average age for the entire population of the generation, including those who passed away earlier, you may actually live much longer, beyond 80 years old to 90s or even 100 years. So talking about the pension scheme, Japan's pension scheme has a long history and has started even before World War II. Probably one of the oldest in this part of the world, at least. And since it developed into current scheme in about half century ago, back in 1961, or actually 6 decades ago. The life expectancy of men back then was only 65 years old, and women were just over 70. The system, therefore, was designed to support you for 10 to 15 years only, after you retired at your age of 55. But your life is much longer now, and you cannot expect the pension system to support you forever. So how you can stay financially healthy when you live much longer? Would you like to continue to work beyond 65 years old? So this is actually theme of the book that I wrote. So good news is that it is probably possible for you to work beyond 65 years old. Why? Because the Japanese population, which was 125 million at its peak a couple of years ago, or more than 10 years ago, I would say, is slowly but surely decreasing. The decrease of labor is a critical issue for the country's economy to sustain the momentum. There are 3 undeveloped labor resources in Japan: women, foreigners, or senior people like us. And if you are mentally and physically healthy, you have the chance to be employed even beyond 65 years old. This is good news. You may be retained and or even newly employed beyond the average retirement age of 65. But naturally, you need to keep up your market value by updating your skill all the time if you wish to be retained. The world is, as we all know, quickly and continuously changing. This is probably the kind of unique situation in Japan, but the people still want to be employed at the company forever. Amazingly, majority of 20s and 30s expect their company, which probably they joined after school, to retain them for their entire career. The former coach, the chief coach of Japan's national soccer team, Philippe Portier, once explained a reason why Japan cannot win in the world match. He said it is because Japanese people obey the traffic signal. He meant to say that you cannot break through until you take a risk. I cannot agree with him more. As we all know, your employer still want to discontinue when the business climate change, even if you endeavor to maintain or enhance your market value. I would urge yourself, therefore, that lifelong employment is kind of illusion or concept of 20th centuries, when you work for 3 decades at most, instead of half century today. So the rule number 2 is that don't expect your employer to employ you forever. Mr. Nakanishi, the former chairman of Hitachi Corporation and a chairman of Keidanren, which is the country's leading business federation, confessed a couple of years ago that Japan Inc. cannot afford to employ their people forever. So, unlike our parents' generation, you cannot rely on your company's brand as they won't retain you forever. If so, you need to be keen to establish and upgrade your own brand instead of brand you currently work for. So the conclusion, the number 3 is conclusion number 3 is to create your own brand and begins to upgrade all the time. In the past, it was kind of clear cut, cut in and cut out, 100% full time until 60 or 55 in the old days, or 65 these days. So 100% full time until your retirement age and 0% work afterwards. Today, it is up to us how to design your new life. One of the greatest business leader, Amuro-san, the former chairman of TEPCO, recently published an essay in which he recommends us to think about the or design work, design your week with 1 day work per week, and spend the rest of the week 6 days for whatever you want to do outside business. I think he's right. What really matters is healthy life expectancy. You know, even you may live until 100 years old or even longer, you cannot be mentally and physically healthy by them. It is really depending on each individual, but we have to be mindful that remaining times to fully appreciate life is shorter than 100 years old, 100 years. Wasting your remaining time or our remaining time to a financial matters, financial activities, particularly to buy personal goods, not good idea. So that is rule number 4. Consider buying the remaining time and the money that you need for your remaining time. So in summary, my advices in this book basically fourfold. One is to keep up your market value. Number 2, don't expect your current company to retain you forever. Instead, try to establish your own brand. And finally, be mindful to design your retirement life, as time is increasingly precious for us. Thank you very much. That's my presentation is all about.
Sue,
Thank
maybe
you.
you can take us through some of your learning about retirement in Australia and what Australians think of it.
Yes, indeed. The title of my talk is Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. And the good news is I'm not going to sing it, but I am going to talk about how this is a misunderstood generation and a misunderstood time of life. If I could have the next slide, please, Ray. I'm going to start by talking about the deficit discourse. Now, I haven't made up this term. I've borrowed it from social work, actually, and it's an incredibly useful term, as you'll see in a minute. Now, just before I go on to the next slide, just a bit of background for people outside Australia. Australia has a superannuation system, a compulsory superannuation system, where we are required to put money away for our retirement. So that's been in place since, I don't know, 1990 or something like that. But there are also expectations that won't be enough, and that you're also supposed to save up, as Aki was just talking about, designing your own retirement. So I'm going to take up that theme in just half a second. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you, Ray. So I'm going to just talk you through some excerpts here from the media that come from marketing to this age group, marketing about retirement, and from government. Now, these are all 2021. I've been collecting examples like these for quite a while now, and they haven't changed. I think that's what Dave calls timeless. They haven't changed. I'll talk to you. I'm going to talk them through. I kind of go anti-clockwise. So my first one is, number 1, you don't have enough to retire. The titles are mine. The example there is a very, very familiar one to anyone of my age group in Australia. You will have seen something like this that tells you you don't have enough to retire on. Now, if you look carefully and closely at this data, you will see it's complete rubbish, because it can't possibly be true. It's basically arguing that no one has enough to retire on, even though the average balances are, which the average balance is the balance saved in superannuation. And the balances required to have this kind of spurious accuracy that you need $271,000 if you were going to, if you were a 50-year-old woman to retire. Now, clearly that's silly, but it's a very, very pervasive theme given to pre-retirees that they won't have enough to retire on. So this, if going down to the one below it, I'm calling you planned badly. It comes from news.com.au, and the emphasis is mine. So as older Australians live longer, some are returning to the workforce years after they retired, it pays to know the financial issues that can result from this employment backflip. So it's, my point is calling it a backflip, and I'm going to come back to that now. It also goes right back to Aki's point a moment ago. So to go over to the other side, you did it wrong is also part of this deficit discourse. And again, this is very, very common. Sometimes you see it's 5 mistakes, sometimes it's 7. I think I've even seen 10. But they're always about the mistakes that you are making or have made to do with retirement. Again, it's pervasive, it's very common, and it hasn't really changed. And the top one is you need help, comes from government. This is a guide for, I'm quoting now, for people in New South Wales who are planning to retire. It can help you manage your money, decide where to live, and find support services, etc. Now that's really aimed at people sort of 50 plus, I think, but the language of it, to me anyway, sounds like they're talking to me as if I'm 80. These are people who've been working since they were 20, and it doesn't sound like that. So part of the deficit discourse is this patronizing way that people talk to people who've been highly competent in their during their working life for 40 or some years. So we might go to the next slide now, please, Ray. Okay, this is a lovely one as well. It's not so much the image as the term of the empty nest. So the 60-something age group is often talked about as empty nesters. It's an odd one because no one else is talked about in terms of their nesting, as far as I know, but it's only at the empty nest stage that the phrase comes in. Now, I have a data set of 60 to 69-year-olds, and I've been interrogating this data set. And what's really interesting is that it is true that children leave home when their parents in their 60s or late 50s. That is true. It's also, but there's kind of a small proportion of people in their 60s who have children in primary schools. It's possible for a man to have children in his 50s or late 50s or early 60s. So there are some young children in these households. But what's really interesting, there's so much that's interesting. But one of the things that's really interesting is that about 20% of households, and I did this survey a month ago, have at least one child living at home who is over 18. So that was a big difference. I personally think that was happening pre-COVID, and COVID has intensified that, but it was certainly a pattern that this idea of empty nest is anachronistic, really, because there are certain age groups where sometimes they come back. Now, while we just stay on this chart for a minute, I also want to talk about other demographic things, because what this deficit discourse doesn't do is capture how diverse the 60 to 69 age group is. Though you can have very young children if you're in your early 60s, if you're a man. But about half, in my data, half of this age group have grandchildren. And those grandchildren can be any age from 0 to over 18. So we have this age group of 60 to 69-year-olds where it's rare but possible to have your own children who are primary school, or to have someone who could be a friend who has grandchildren over 18. And we just don't hear about this diversity in the conversation at all. Next slide, please.
Hey, Sue, you've hit on a point. I recently discovered a lady I went to high school with is now a great-grandmother. So, there is no limits to the diversity.
Yeah, it would be quite possible in my data. I didn't actually ask about great-grandmother. I might next time. So this deficit view, as I've implied already, stated already, is it's wrong, basically. It's about talking down to an audience of people who are 65 as if they're 85, and it makes people feel uncertain about retiring. So if you want people to retire, and if you want them to plan for retirement, and you want them to live a healthy life after retirement, it seems unfortunate that the message you're giving them is don't retire because you won't have enough money. And there's a whole load of other imagery, which I won't go into now, which is associated with making retirement look an unattractive thing to do. So it's that particular message. And so this is about why I'm saying do not let me be misunderstood. So let's talk about some data now. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is from that data set that I mentioned before, and this comes back to, I'm going to, very similar points to Dave was making. I asked people who were 20 to 29, 40 to 49, and 60 to 69, whether they were enjoying their life right now, and it was a scale that went from 0 to 100. And amongst the 20 to 29-year-olds, half gave a rating of over 7 out of 10, or 70%. Just under that, very similar numbers because it was 100 per cell, 46% to 40 to 49-year-olds said they gave that kind of rating. And in contrast, 69% of 60 to 69-year-olds gave that kind of rating. So many more older people said they were enjoying their life right now than younger people. I've actually run the survey twice with the 60 to 69-year-olds, and the results are very similar, which is always good when you find that out. Yeah. Oh, and the main reason, now you remember I just talked about how diverse this particular age group is. It's therefore true that the reasons why 60 to 69-year-olds are enjoying themselves varies quite a lot. So it varies if you have grandchildren or you don't, or it varies if you're working or you're not. But one of the big themes that comes all the way through it is about the freedom to be me. That's the big one. I can do what I like now. Even though I might have my 20-somethings living at home with me, I can still do what I like. And the next slide, thank you. And the second reality that is, I've already really referred to, is that there are so many ways you can change how you work in your 60s. The deficit discourse, or the discourse, has been historically that you get to an age and stop working, and that's it, you stay stopped. But you can choose to cut back your hours, you can decide to switch to a new part-time job, you can choose to stop work and then restart. You can choose to stop and stay stopped, or you can retrain. And I have some data on that. Won't go through it now, but we might go to the next slide. Yeah, so here are some quotes from people that I've spoken to. And really the big word here is choose. You can be selective. I'm 67 now, and I'm making strategic choices about how I want to work and who I want to work with. Someone else, I'm in my late 70s and still running my business. I changed direction and retrained in my 60s so that I can go on working. And she says she won't retire. I was a general manager of an automotive company. I retired 3 years ago, took an early retirement. I did some social work, volunteer work. I got bored. Then about 3 years ago, I joined a company that is working as floor staff. So there are so many ways we can do this when we are in our 60s, and we can stop if we want to, or we can do anything really. We can choose. And the next slide, very quickly, is these are not backflips. The media might call them that, but they're simply mature people making interesting and sensible decisions about how they want to live their life. And we'll go on to the next slide. Now, I've been a little bit positive so far. I've talked about how people have choice. I've talked about how people are happy. But it's not all sunshine and lollipops, to be honest. There are some, it can be a very difficult time. And part of the discourse for Australia is that we're told that we have to plan for retirement. But one of the difficulties is that it's very difficult to plan for. So I have some data from a couple of years ago that said about 20% of people, these were retirees that I was talking to, they had lost their job and couldn't get a new one. So they were retired involuntary, really, because they couldn't get a job. They'd retired. They'd been retrenched at 55 pounds. About another 20%, this is quite high, this figure might be a bit high, had retired because of their own ill health, and about 6% had retired because of their partner's ill health. So on that data, that's about half of people who really couldn't have planned for what happened to them. And so this discourse, as I keep saying, about you must plan, is impossible, really. And I think, I mean, that must apply to Japan and other countries as well. Now, some people leave their workplace because they're unhappy there. There are some people in their 60s who are unhappy in their workplace, or they start to lose their consulting clients. In the last survey that we did, I asked people whether they'd ever felt too old at work, or they'd felt discriminated against at work, or they'd felt they were looked down on because of their age. And of the 60 to 69-year-olds, 25% said they had. So it was a negative experience of being at work and not feeling sort of valued, I guess. And the next slide, thank you. Now I've got two pictures here. One is a picture of someone on the right who might be in her 60s, always difficult to tell. The other one is obviously not in their 60s, and I've chosen her because I think she's probably in her 20s. And the reason for that is because I want to compare these two decades. So the 60s, and I'm also going to argue the 20s, is a time of transition. In both cases, you change where you live quite often. You downsize in both cases quite often. You change who you live with. If you're in your 60s, you might no longer be living with your children. And if you're in your 20s, the other way around, or you're with a partner or not with a partner, or share house, or whatever it might be, it's a time of change. There's a time in which we change our work patterns. I've already just talked about retirees, but it happens very much to people in their 20s. They try this and that, and they experiment, and then they maybe study again and do all sorts of other stuff. And in both cases, my argument is that this is a time of developing a sense of identity. We know that, I think, if we look back on our 20s and say that was a time of developing a sense of identity. You might see it in your children if you have children of that age. But it's also true of the 60s because we're doing the same kinds of things. So this static idea of everyone in their 60s is the same certainly doesn't reflect what we've been seeing in the work we've been doing with this age group. And I think it's one last chat, it would be kind. So to conclude, don't let me be misunderstood. Representation of the 60-somethings in general and retirement in particular just seems out of step with actual behaviour. It just seems anachronistic, really. They can be a time to be happy. You're free to make your choices. You can experiment with different work and living patterns just as 20-somethings do. And they're not mistakes. They're experiments. They're not wrong. The deficit discourse is what is wrong. And I think now we just go to the final chart. Thank you.
So let me make a couple of points following up from Sue. Both Sue and Aki talked about the employment situation. And one of the things I find very interesting is that if you look around the world in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a real uplift into the ageism discussion, particularly in the workplace, and mostly in terms of people hiring people in their 50s, 60s and 70s, or the lack of opportunity. But that's also being seen by the debates around people want to shift. Now, one of the hardest things that most employers and most marketers have is the idea that people in their 60s might want to try something new, which is why I use the term retirement. And I'll give you an indication. There was a story, the left-hand side, there was a story last year because an ad agency in Australia created news because they said they were willing to take on an intern over 55. Well, is that supposed to be news or should that be normal? Now, I will tell you that in some countries, it's actually illegal to employ an intern that is of that age group. Up until quite recently in Hong Kong, for example, you could legally only be an intern if you were under 30. Now, they've changed that legislation. Some countries, there is no age limits, but the idea for most companies of taking on interns in their 50s, 60s, 70s is like, yeah, but they won't last long, but they're not interested. They can't do new things, which of course is the mythologies we have to change. As Ray clicked into the next chart, one of the other things we have to think about is what Sue touched on is, my experience is, having done research in this area for literally decades, is it doesn't matter where in the world and how old people are, when you start talking about the aging population, everybody thinks of their own grandmother. And instead of thinking about people that remind you of your own grandmother, click it again, Ray, what you need to do is think about people like this. Now, not necessarily because this guy looks like me, but because people in their 60s, for example, are technologically capable, are people that are exploring new ideas, and are people that want to get on with the next more than a third of their life, the next 30 years, and do something new. So I refer to those age groups as new life builders because my own research has indicated that people in their 60s and 70s in particular are usually thinking ahead to what are they going to do next, not reflecting on what's happened, but what's the next big thing. And Ray, we were just having that discussion before we came online, right? About you've got plans what you want to do next. I've got plans what I want to do next. I think we all do. We just want to get out and try new things. So there you go. Ray, maybe we could open up for the discussion. I know the chat room, some people have been reflecting on a question I asked about, are you going to retire? Are you thinking, how do we think about it? You know, and most people, it's sort of, no, I'm not going to retire. I'm going to do stuff. Maybe not too sure what, but I'm going to do something.
Thanks, Dave. And yeah, there's wonderful chat in the chat session. We've also got some questions in the Q&A, but there's still time for you to add your questions to the list. I'm going to start by synthesizing 2 or 3 of the questions in there, Sue, and they're for you, so you might want to be unmuted ready. In terms of the quotes, were they from men and were there gender differences? And in terms of things like health, has that got an impact on what people are saying to you, body shape, issues like that? So gender, health, body shape, etc.
Okay, body shape, I don't know, but I'll come back to health. The quotes were female, female, male, of the ones that I had there. In the data, I don't have the exact physical figures to hand, but the women were happier than the men in the over 60s, 60 to 69. And where there was unhappiness or people talking about challenges is actually quite just as an aside, I wanted to make sure that in the survey it wasn't designed along the deficit discourse line. So I didn't want to ask questions about, you know, what's wrong with retirement or what's wrong with you. So it can be quite hard to do. But we asked about challenges, and health is one of them. So some of those challenges are kind of natural aging type things, like, you know, a bit move a bit slower or something like that. But it's, you know, nevertheless true that there are people who have had serious health problems, and those do become much more common in your 60s, diabetes, etc. So I haven't really captured all of that, but there's definitely something there.
So we have another question. I don't know if any of the 3 of you have got any data or views about how big is entrepreneurship in the over 50s, 60s, etc.
Well, if you look at the studies that have been done by a couple of the major universities in the United States, one thing is that I think it was not Harvard, I can't remember which school it was, But their latest piece of research from about 18 months ago clearly indicated that when you look at startups, the vast majority of successful startups were started by people that were 45 plus. So in terms of entrepreneurship, yes, an awful lot of people, as Sue indicated and even Aki indicated, a lot of people in their 50s and 60s are maybe forced into entrepreneurship, as in they get forced out of their regular job with a big company and they start something because, just as I did with, for example, starting a consultancy or whatever, but, you know, of all sorts of things. But the interesting thing is that the success rate is much higher for people over 45, 50 than it is for those younger. Now, that's got to do with experience. And it's an interesting because when you look at the published academic papers on this area, what they do point out is that investors, for some reason, mistakenly believe they should invest with young people with bright ideas instead of investing with older people with sound ideas and background and history. And so it's an interesting thing that when you talk about entrepreneurship, that older people find it harder to get startup money based on, you know, what seems to be, again, myths that, oh, well, we should invest in the young ideas will be fresher and newer, but quite often are just not correct, you know,
So that adds together quite well with the VC problem of they tend to discriminate against women, they tend to discriminate against ethnic minorities. They assume that young men have all the answers, which well,
it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting. I cannot remember the name of the show in England. Ray, it's the equivalent. But if you look at Shark Tank from the US, you know, only recently I've started watching Shark Tank with some interest. And what fascinates me, and I must admit, it took about 4 or 5 episodes before I realized none of these people are over 50. All the people that are coming on the show asking for money, it's primarily, and if it is somebody over 50, they've got their 12-year-old genius son who actually does all the talking. So it's a sort of interesting bias.
So to the three of you, we've got a question here. To what extent is the research industry solving the problem, and to what extent is the research industry compounding the problem?
Okay, I think my history of looking at this subject is, I'll come down to 3 quick points. One is I consistently hear from research companies when I ask them, well, how come you don't seem to have a lot more results for people over 60? I keep on hearing, well, we do cover people over 60, but the problem is, you know, they don't know how to use mobile phones or smartphones well enough to answer the question, so we can't get enough people to answer it. Well, in that case, I challenge every market research professional. If you're trying to investigate a population, you don't tell them how they should answer the question. You find a way to ask the question in a means that they find appropriate and easy to do. So, you know, they're doing it wrong. The second thing is that, I don't know if Ray remembers this, but 10 years ago at an SMR conference, I actually presented a paper where, amongst other things, I pointed out that when I'd asked the 11 largest market research companies in the world about their standard surveys, I found out that none of them asked anybody over 60 years of age. Now that's changed. They now all do include people over 60, but nearly all of them, and nearly all major surveys, when they break down answers by age group, will fine-tune age group brackets into 5 years. So 20 to 25s, 25 to 30s, 30 to 35s. And then when it gets to 60 or 65, it's literally 65 plus, which I always find is ridiculous, because then basically what you're saying is that somebody 85 and somebody 65 is the same. Well, that's like saying somebody 20 and somebody that's 40 is the same, right? I mean, it's just idiotic. And the third thing is that I think part of the issue is there's still a misconception and belief inside market research companies about older people. And again, I put this as the challenge. For example, how many market research companies take on interns in their 60s and 70s at all levels of the company and all positions? Nobody does. And one of the things they need to do is not just consider about keeping Ray Pointer on as an advisor, a senior advisor, but maybe thinking about hiring more 60-year-olds at all levels, and then using their advice and experience to figure out how to talk to people of those age groups better.
Come in with a slightly different thought. I agree with all of that, but just a different thought, which is when you're young and you start in research, I think it's very tempting to just think the way the agency already thinks. So when I, for example, started in research, we used to divide the population into under and over 35. So not 20 years, 35 to whatever. And for a long time, I and my friends who worked with me, we accepted that because we were young in research and we didn't question it. And I think that there's probably the same kinds of things that if you are young in research, do question that kind of stuff. That was inherited nonsense. Yeah, that's my point. Question it.
I would make one point though, if I could, Ray, about the fact that things have changed. And I'll give you a simple example. I was commenting on this to a client the other day. If you look at the beauty industry, and of course the beauty industry often gets criticized about the focus on young, skinny women, and it's not representative of the population, etc. But it has changed. And the simple example is Shiseido from Japan was the first major global beauty company to actually start thinking about older populations of women. Now, they did that partly by coming in with sub-brands that were particularly targeted at women in their 50s and 60s. But more importantly, what we've seen over the last 20 years, if you look at the advertising and the models used and the spokeswomen used in Shiseido advertising, in the last 20 years, they have aged by about 20 years. So 20 years ago, they were all literally 20, 21. Now they're somewhere around, on average, around 40. Some much older, some younger. But the average age of the spokeswomen and the models is getting older. And we're starting to see that in the beauty industry. Like L'Oreal does that now. A lot of the major global beauty companies have followed that trend. It's not quite reflective all the time of 60 pluses, but it is more an older population suiting older age groups. We're not seeing that in a lot of other categories, but it is starting a little in some steps.
So we're running a little short of time. People are having to move on, but we've got one more question in the Q&A panel, so we'll certainly ask that. Any data on poverty amongst this age group or the implications of poverty?
I don't have poverty as such, but I do have some data on the more disadvantaged, particularly in the Australian population. Women who have had an interrupted work career have less superannuation, will retire with less money. If you are, so if you're a woman who took quite a chunk of time out of to look after children and then got divorced, you're in a worse situation. So there are, and there are some very sad stories. There are, I'm sure only a very few really, but about that generation of women, some people in that generation of women becoming homeless because they don't have anything. So they missed out on this on the system. So that's the only part of that I have on poverty.
I think it's true to say, Aki, that in Japan, we are starting to see more and more stories about the shortfall. Not everybody's financially prepared, right?
It is, right. So if you are not financially ready, which most of the people are not, then the people are very careful, increasingly careful to open their wallets. That's the reality here. But actually, poverty is a bigger issue, to be honest, at least in Japan, in younger generation overall, because the older you are, the richer you are. That's kind of, situation in this market at least.
If you look across the region, you would find there are countries, Japan, Australia, Singapore, where people have had forced, in one form or another, superannuation in Australia, for example, but forced saving habits, basically their whole adult life. So the older populations in those countries, generally, there is poverty, but there is a more preparation for it. But of course, in places like China, for example, where that's not the case, and that's why you often hear the discussion that China will get poorer before it gets older. And that's simply because with an aging, shrinking population, that aging population is not financially prepared for a long retirement. They're nowhere near, and the government can't support it. So that is an issue in many countries, and we're going to see, I think, a lot more talk about the poverty issue amongst older people, which goes back to the need to go back to work and start things. And I've just seen on the chat room, David McCullum. Thanks, David, for asking the question. Is there evidence of people wanting to go back to the, in their 60s, wanting to go back into a more junior positions or start a new job or profession? Well, actually, there is. There's a lot of evidence about people willing to go into part-time or full-time roles in new areas, partly because, well, I just want to do it, partly because I need to do it. And for example, we've seen different, lots of examples of that, of people wanting to go back into more casual jobs, lower end jobs, or to try something different. And again, this is one of the things related to that internship thing. When I talked to the lady who's in charge of the Internship Bureau of Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and I talked to her about this idea of aging people or people in their 60s wanting internships, she actually went away and came back and said, what we've discovered is there is a demand for that. It's just we've got to get the law changed. And the reason there's a demand for it is because people are hitting their 60s and saying, I need to make a little bit of money, but more importantly, I need to do it in something that's interesting. And I don't want to be an accountant for the rest of my life. I don't want to be a market researcher for the rest of my life. I want to be an art historian, or I want to be, something else. And so it goes to the entrepreneurship, it goes to restarting work, it goes to retrying things.
I think this is probably actually a fairly well-established pathway as well. If I think about the UK, where people would, depending on their occupation, retire at 55 if they were fire or police, a little bit later, and then take a second career, or they would get involved in charitable work, or they would get involved in community action groups, these sort of things, because one of the things we see is that not everybody associates wage with things I want to do later on. Some people have to, many people have to, but others are looking for something to do. And I do a lot of online courses where I'm a student, and there are a lot of older people learning languages, taking degrees for the first time or taking a second degree. So they are certainly there. Proportions, I think that's less clear. So I think we probably ought to wrap it up there. Now, thank you so much, Sue, Aki, and Dave. Dave in particular was the driving force for this session.